Can you talk and then, yeah.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am delighted to welcome you to today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. We're so pleased you could join us for this session on enhancing climate resilience through dam and barrier removal. My name is Dr. Miriam Axel, and I am delighted to be your host today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're delighted to have you here, and we hope to welcome you back. I'm pleased to share that all of our previous science talks from the entire 2024 series hosted by Professor Grace Oluwasanya, as well as the entire 2025 series, are available on our website and our YouTube channel. The website is unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. Today's talk, like all of our others, will be recorded, and the recording will be made available after the session. We'll also conclude with an interactive Q&A session, so please use the Q&A box to put your questions in, and I will be sure to read them out to our speaker. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sara NULL. Her research and teaching focuses on addressing the potential to protect aquatic systems while maintaining water resource benefits for people. She's the environmental water management lead here at UNU-INWEH, and she leads research initiatives that integrate multiple disciplines, including drought and wet period management, dam construction, removal, reservoir reoperations, water use efficiency and habitats, climate change adaptation, and water quality management and monitoring. And you can watch her previous science talk, excellent talk, on our website as well from 2024. Professor NULL is a professor of watershed sciences at Utah State University, and she's been awarded a career grant from the National Science Foundation and sole PI star from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And her work has been highlighted in a wide range of diverse media outlets, including the New York Times, Science Magazine, National Geographic, BBC Newsday, and others. She was named the 2021 to 2022 Cal Trout Ecosystem Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center, and is part of a multidisciplinary team synthesizing cutting-edge research for policymakers to address lake-level decline in Utah's Great Salt Lake. And now, without further ado, it is my great honor and pleasure to turn it over to you, Professor NULL. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Let me get my slides shared here. Oh, can you see those? Let me get in presenter mode. Does that look right for everybody? Okay, I think so. So go ahead and get started. So thank you for inviting me here today to share the literature review that we just did about enhancing climate resilience through dam and barrier removal. This was funded by American Rivers and Resources Legacy Fund, and I'll talk a little bit more about that right at the end. Okay, so millions of dams and in-stream barriers exist globally. And you might be thinking, well, how many are there? And that's a great question, and nobody really knows. So some assessments have been done in specific places. For example, in the United States, we think that there's more than 850,000 dams and smaller stream barriers. In Europe, an estimate of more than 1.2 million stream barriers exist. And in New Zealand, there's an estimate of maybe around 130,000 dams and stream barriers. Now, there are large international data sets, but they usually include only large dams. For example, dams over 15 meters. So you can see here one database from Global Dam Tracker. You can see how widespread dams are, of course, globally, but these don't include the smaller barriers. So for this study, I'm going to be lumping large dams and smaller stream barriers, things like run-of-river dams, diversion dams, low-head dams, even culverts and road crossings. But we know that as societies, we've built millions of dams, barriers, and in-stream structures. And sometimes the solutions of yesterday have become some of the problems of today. So this data is just for the United States, and this is showing on the x-axis time. The gray dots are dams constructed. So you can see those through times. The y-axis is dam height. So you can see a lot of our larger dams in this country were built in the last half of the 1900s. And then more recently, you can see dams removed. So in the US, over 2,200 dams have been removed. Dams and barriers have been removed. And 84% of those have been since 2000. So you can see this more increasing trend. And I would say there's parallels for dam removal, certainly in Europe, although maybe not in other places where dam construction has been more recent. Simultaneously, we have climate pressures that impact our watersheds and our river systems. So quickly, we have warming temperatures, of course, and with that, we have shrinking snowpacks. That leads to often the shorter wet seasons that can have really severe or volatile precipitation paired with longer, drier, dry seasons. With melting glaciers, we have rising seas and of course more severe wildfires. So this is the changing conditions often since dams have been built. So I'm trying to show that here. And again, I have I have the most dam removal data from the United States. So this figure is just for the US. The dots here are dam removals. And then I put that over precipitation anomaly. So I took the recent 30 years of precipitation and I subtracted precipitation from the dam building era in the United States. So from 1940 to 1970. So you can see kind of the red, orange, yellow colors are where we have of where it's becoming drier, less precipitation. And then the blues and purples are where it's becoming wetter. So you can see looking at this is dam removals, that clearly conditions have changed in some of the places that dams have been being removed. But we can't say consistently either by season or for the whole country, oh, it's, consistently getting wetter or drier. We have this mix of changing conditions. So that led me to the question to think, is removing obsolete, unsafe, and outdated dams and barriers a strategy to adapt to climate variability, specifically more frequent floods and droughts? So that was really the driving question for this research. So here's a conceptual figure showing that when we built dams, we had, lots of regions had water development phases where we would want to store and re-regulate flows so that we had water consistently during the summer season and we could hold back that water during the wet season when water is a hazard. And now we're in the current conditions where sometimes we have these really dry years when maybe our dams and our reservoirs aren't filling up, paired with really wet conditions that can exceed the flows that dams were built for. And then thinking about a climate resilient future, thinking, are there some dams that we might remove? So say species could move to higher elevations or have a mosaic of habitats, maybe reconnect some floodplains and rivers, reduce safety hazards from unsafe dams, bring back maybe some tribal or community benefits. So basically I wanted to think about in what conditions might that has been in what conditions might removing dams promote climate resiliency, and what research has been done on this topic? A couple terms. So when I say climate resilience, I'm talking about the ability to prepare for, respond to, and recover from adverse events related to climate change. And then I just brought up nature-based solutions. So this is the idea of using natural landscapes to provide both ecological and societal benefits by allowing dynamic natural processes. So to put maybe a little bit more of an idea on this, so there's been recent ideas about climate resilience can allow watersheds to cope with drought, flooding, wildfire, heat waves, all these more severe weather events that we've been experiencing. So some examples, these aren't necessarily dam removal examples, but some examples of nature-based solutions might be, as I just mentioned, connecting rivers and floodplains, things like reforestation. In the Western US, where I live, reintroducing beaver as a driver of natural processes to restore natural processes is very popular. Then there's green infrastructure. So that's infrastructure that we might build it to mimic natural conditions or manage places for benefits we care about. So things like managed aquifer recharge, for example, or built wetlands. And then we can compare that with gray or built infrastructure like dams, water treatment facilities, aqueducts, and conveyances. And I'm by no means implying or saying that gray infrastructure is bad. We build this for a reason. But sometimes when gray infrastructure exceeds its capacities, it can fail more catastrophically than natural systems. Okay, so that thinking along these lines of focusing on unsafe, obsolete, kind of underperforming types dams. So we know that a lot of dam failures have occurred when we have extreme storm conditions paired with aging dams that are in poor conditions. So there are a whole lot of examples of dam failures or even near misses when we have these old dams, they haven't been getting money or attention for maintenance. And then we have extreme storm conditions where maybe we have, precipitation events or runoff events that exceed our historical conditions, often by a lot. And so here's one news article. This was from 2020 about Edenville Dam in Michigan, and Sanford Dam below it that failed during a huge storm event. And there's been a lot of research on this topic. We know that aging dams become more dangerous as stream flows exceed the design specifications. So this figure here on the left is showing predicted 2080, 100-year flood returns. Well, what was historically the 100-year flood returns, and really what that flood frequency will be in 2080. So it's predicted. So in some places you have a decrease. So the 100-year flood return interval is becoming longer in drier regions. And some places you have an increase where, that we might have a 100-year flood return interval from in the 1900s might happen every 20 or 40 years in the future. So that would be more increasing flood risk. And the same thing here is shown on the right side here, where this is, particularly putting it into years. And so a 100-year flood return interval in the future, in the end of this century, might be in some places as low as, say, a 20-year return interval. Okay, in the US, I don't have, unfortunately, I couldn't find this dam hazard and conditions ratings globally, but here in the US, we have it from the National Inventory of Dams. So this figure here on the right, I'm trying to show the hazard of people here on the x-axis. And so low hazard means there might be economic and environmental damages just for dam owners. Significant hazards means pretty widespread economic and environmental losses, but probably not a risk to human life. And then the high hazard shows where it's a dam failure is likely to cause deaths. And then I've grouped on this number of dams on the y-axis, and then I've grouped on this dam condition. And here I did a lot of grouping. So satisfactory is just the dams that are rated in satisfactory condition. And then everything else I put as not satisfactory. So fair rating. Fair means that under extreme hydrologic conditions, we could have dam safety deficiencies. And that's exactly what we're looking for in this study. Or poor, where we know that dam deficiencies exist. Unsatisfactory means we know there's dam deficiencies, they're pretty extreme, they require immediate remedial action. And then we have some kind of more squishy categories, and I put these all also into not satisfactory. So not rated. So we just don't know the condition of some dams. Or not available. The dam rating is available, but it's not transparent to the public. It's not released to other people. So really what the dams that we're really concerned about are these high risk to people and not in a satisfactory condition. All right, and then we also care about, or for this study, we focus on obsolete or outdated or underperforming dams. So those structures that no longer serve their intended purposes are kind of relics from earlier periods. And importantly with this, the cost of removing dams is a small percentage, maybe 30 or 40% of the cost of retrofitting dams. And I've checked multiple studies. I put a reference here. This doesn't seem like it's true, but it actually can, in many circumstances, be cheaper to remove dams than to retrofit them and upgrade them for increasing flood risk or increasing environmental regulations. Sometimes this also includes small structures that have been abandoned where maybe, and these are often small run of river or kind of culverts or low head weirs that were put into rivers maybe centuries ago. They still exist. We don't even know who owns them, and they become increasingly unsafe. And then also in this category, and this is shown here, this is on this picture, I have Iron Gate Dam that was just removed from the Klamath River. Often hydropower dams can fall into this category, where hydropower dams with maybe increasing droughts or recurrent droughts just aren't producing the benefits that they were intended to produce. And so you add on maybe some maintenance or some retrofits, and all of a sudden, economically, these dams no longer make sense. Okay, so this brings me to the literature review. So I wanted to know, can dam and barrier removal sometimes increase climate resilience? So I did a literature review to understand this topic. I used the Scopus database, but then a lot of dam removal studies are in the gray literature. So I also repeated search terms, and so I used the search terms dam removal, barrier removal, dam decommissioning, and then climate or resilience or resiliency or adaptation. So you can see my search terms. I repeated them in Google Scholar to try to pick up the gray literature surrounding dam removal. Google Scholar, of course, brings up the top hits. And so the most recent studies tend to get buried. So then I repeated that for Google Scholar, my search since 2020. And altogether, I would say this returned about 300 studies. And then I started reviewing them. And so some quick reviews, like sometimes that I would get studies about, say, removing barriers of global markets, say, for climate resilience. And so that was clearly not on my topic. So I'd take those studies out. And then I also wanted to have, I wanted the authors of the studies to say something specific about climate resilience or climate change or climate variability. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Didn't necessarily have to be quantitative, but I wanted some direct linkages there. And then I used snowball sampling. So if in the references I came across more pertinent studies, I would add them right in. Okay, so one major finding is we have a ton of literature about dam impacts. So how dams impact people, or more commonly, the environment. I mean, thousands and thousands of studies, but we don't do a very good job of always linking that with climate resilience. So we have one whole huge group of literature about dam impacts. Sometimes there are studies about how removing dams restores rivers, and this we have maybe a growing literature, but we're starting to get a pretty good handle on the removal effects and how we can restore rivers through dam removal. And then sometimes there are these separate studies talking about how river restoration boosts climate resilience, but there's not a lot of direct linkages. I was surprised by how few studies really directly connected removing dams with climate resilience. And then there were I'm going to call them hollow statements about climate resilience. So it was really common for papers in, say, the first paragraph and the last paragraph to say, I have this dam removal study or perception study or legal analysis, whatever it is, and it's important in a world with climate change. But they would never really come back to that thought. Maybe in the last paragraph, they'd say, here, I've done this whole study, and this is important with climate change. But there was nothing connecting climate change and the study they did, except for this kind of hollow statement. So that removed about 50% of the studies right there. They really had nothing to say. So I was looking for some direct connections, maybe quantifying is best, but nuancing, confirming, contradicting, describing climate resiliency changes. So I was looking for really something to grasp onto where I could say, well, how does barrier removal affect climate resilience? And I wanted to be able to answer that how question. So all told, I found 50 studies, my team and I found 50 studies that quantified or qualified climate resilience from dam and barrier removal. So on the left, I just have included the types of studies that I included. They were very far ranging, as you can see. And on the right, I have these studies through time. So how, when these studies were published. This goes through September of 2024. You can see an increasing trend. The first study, surprisingly, was just done in 2009. So we have about 15 years of studies that have looked at dam or barrier removal and climate resilience. Okay, and now here's some of the, just very quick, the spatial distribution of the studies that we included or that met our criteria and were included in this study. A lot focused on North America and the US. I didn't put anything about in my search criteria about where studies should be done. They should be international. There were a number of global studies. I thought there would be more studies in Europe because I know there is a fairly strong history in Europe of dam removal, but far and away in North America, most studies were from North America. And then in the United States, most studies were from the two coasts, so mainly the West Coast and the East Coast. And that tracks with other dam removal impact studies that have been done. Okay, so I didn't get a robust enough literature to really do a meta-analysis, but I could group these into what types of climate resilience benefits are being discussed in dam removal or barrier removal studies. And I should go back on the previous slide. Oops. Two previous slides, you can see that some of these studies were actually like monitoring studies following dam removal, but a lot weren't. A lot were monitoring, modeling studies, or things like structured decision making, and a whole lot were things like syntheses, perspectives, and commentaries. Okay, so back to this this big kind of nice results figure. So I tried to group these into why are we thinking about removing dams for climate resilience? And so reconnecting rivers is, I put as its own, because in some studies, authors would say, we want to reconnect rivers for resilient landscapes. And that was the objective, was reconnected rivers. And there was sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit assumption that this would improve climate resiliency sometimes for fisheries, sometimes for people, sometimes for sediment. There's all sorts of reasons. And so there's a lot of overlap with reconnecting rivers and other objectives. Sometimes some authors would say, I'm interested in looking at, say, if certain fish species could access colder water in the headwaters of systems if rivers are reconnected. So in those instances, I would, code this as, okay, this paper looked at reconnecting rivers for fisheries for stream temperature. So there's a lot of, I would say, reconnecting rivers was just a catch-all. Important, but it was a catch-all. And then I grouped other biological benefits, water quality benefits, physical or chemical benefits I lumped together, and then social benefits. So overall, I would say a lot of studies looked at fisheries, particularly migratory fishes, so things like trout, salmon, herring on the East Coast. A lot of stream temperature studies looking at the benefits of, again, moving, say, accessing colder water in headwaters. I thought that there would be many more flow regime studies that there are. The idea of removing dams to bring back more of a natural flow regime. And those maybe are captured in the dam impact studies. There's not a whole lot linking them to climate resilience. Probably more with connected fluxes. We're thinking about like sediment transport, and there have been some nice, interesting studies looking at dam removal, bringing sediment down to coastal regions as some resilience for rising sea levels. So there's some really neat studies coming out here, some that looked at reservoir greenhouse gases. And then by and far, the biggest group of studies was for social reasons, with safety being the primary one. So there's been a number of studies looking at dams to remove to often increase human safety. The lost utility, this comes out directly. I've told you that I've focused really on outdated or underperforming types of dams. And so that's bringing up, so this, some studies qualified how much utility is lost, or really does this dam make sense economically, or from the benefits that we're getting from them. Tribal values came up a good deal. And again, tribal values were probably paired with fisheries and reconnecting rivers an awful lot of the time. And the idea of community resilience, the idea of just making our community safest and removing those flood hazards that could be impacting floods, human safety. So if I haven't explicitly said this, I could recount. One study could be counted in multiple places if they really specifically described the objectives, the climate resilience objectives that were achieved or that were aimed to achieve with modeling studies. And then I was interested a lot in the metrics. So I was thinking, well, how do we measure climate resilience? And when I started out doing this study, that wasn't totally clear to me. And there's some social science studies that talk about how to measure climate resilience, but a lot of them are hard to actually put into practice. And so I was interested, well, how do these authors quantify, or how could we quantify climate resilience from removing dams and barriers? And I got, all told, we found about 70 unique metrics. And so I'm just going to present a couple of them here. So we could look at the climate. This is kind of repeating from maybe the resilience benefits in the last slide. So we could say, what climate impacts are there? Say some warming stream temperatures, or drought and climate variability, or extreme precipitation and flooding. And if the dam is removed, what resilience benefits do we get? And so those are those objectives that I talked about in the last slide. So maybe access to cooler stream reaches for salmon and trout, or the diversity of habitats and species, or human health and safety. Those are the objectives of why these dams might be removed. So what's kind of the nature-based solution here would be, reconnecting rivers, or maybe providing space for flood flows, or to dampen the peak of flood flows. And then the metrics were neat because sometimes they were blissfully simple, and sometimes they could be, very specific and take a lot of expertise. So, in the simplest, people looked at connected river lengths in terms of kilometers or stream miles. And so that was a really easy metric. Some were harder. So some other ones that were common were like days exceeding certain temperature thresholds. So days exceeding temperatures appropriate, say, for cold water fishes. Sometimes like the max is a 77-day max temperature. So we could get maybe some more complex metrics and then some easy ones again. So thinking of diversity of habitats and species. So sometimes authors said, what's the abundance of species? What are the prevalence of habitat types? Again, connected river length came in. And then for extreme precipitation and flooding, some common ones were, as I showed earlier in some slides, what's the return period of the historical 100-year flood? What are some changes in annual average stream flow? What's the probable maximum flood? And so there was some pretty tangible metrics that authors are using. Another really interesting thing I found is that dam removal practitioners are already identifying climate resilience as a reason to remove, or sometimes to upgrade or retrofit dams. And so this is, I would say, a topic that's maybe slower to come into the scientific literature, but dam removal practitioners and restoration practitioners are already doing this. So as a couple examples, the lower Glenbrook Dam, that's in Point Reyes National Seashore in California. The reasons to remove it, specifically climate adaptation to restore natural hydrologic conditions and combat sea level rise, were specifically listed for removing that dam. In Taiwan, a check dam in the Chichuan Stream was removed for the resilience of critically endangered salmon. And then I would say replacing pipe culverts with adequately sized larger culverts or box culverts to accommodate larger flood flows is really common. And this is an interesting one because there are guides often put out in the US, like states or counties, and internationally, sometimes by provinces, like with things like replacing culverts for climate resilience. So, I mean, just very direct connections. And these are often the smaller barriers. But these types of barriers can become really dangerous during flood flows if they wash out or if water washes over roadways. So we have those really dangerous conditions of flooded roads and people in cars and people not always recognizing the danger. Okay, and now really importantly, this pains me a little bit that this slide I put so late because this is so important, but I want to emphasize that maintaining dams and barriers is also a strategy for climate resilience. So by no means is this research meant to say, you know, we should take out all dams and barriers. That's not the point. It was really focused on more the unsafe and the underperforming and the obsolete dams. So this is not by any means a full literature review, is outside the scope to look at of this study, of my study, to look at when do maintaining dams or building new dams and barriers provide climate resilience benefits. But we know these benefits exist. So just some of the climate resilience benefits from maintaining dams that came up in the literature that I included are things like novel ecosystems where maybe traditional historical habitats no longer exist. So we have these novel ecosystems and they're important to maintain. Things like blocking non-native species, that's often important reason why fisheries managers will want to keep specific dams in place. Things like managing cold water with the reservoir, the hypolimnion of especially large dams where we can manage cold water. Sometimes toxins in the sediment, especially where there is maybe histories of hydraulic mining. And then, of course, lots of direct benefits in terms of hydropower, water supply, and flood reduction. And so those needs aren't going away. But I would say that this study, if we could think about what dams do we want to maintain in our landscapes and give funding to update and retrofit those dams, make sure they're safe. And by removing some of the unsafe and obsolete dams, we might free up more of that funding for where we need it. Okay, so some of the key findings from this literature review are first that dam removal reconnects rivers, sediment fluxes, habitats, fish and wildlife populations, so we don't get these disjunct populations. Those all have widespread benefits for climate resilience. There was a lot about temperature. So as air temperature warms, removing dams and barriers is an important way to provide access to cooler upstream reaches. Then as storms become more intense, removing unsafe, aging, obsolete dams can help improve human safety. And then these next key findings, I would say, are more geared to the academic community. And so I'd say it's time for scientists to think beyond assessing the impacts of dams. We have thousands and thousands of papers on this topic. And so thinking about, you know, maybe removal and climate resiliency or really the reasons why we might remove or maintain dams in our landscapes is probably the better questions for the 21st century. Knowing that dams and stream barriers have already been removed to bolster resilience, and maybe the academic community in some cases needs to catch up with what practitioners are doing, and thinking about ways to measure resilience to volatile weather. That can be really straightforward, or that can be more specific depending on the resilience goals. And then a big takeaway is that a resilient future will likely combine some of these nature-based solutions of removing dams with keeping dams and built infrastructure on our landscape. We're going to need both of those together. So some of the papers and products from this research, we have this paper is in peer review right now. It's back on my plate for revision with minor revisions. A white paper has come out, so you could Google this, barrier removal as a strategy for climate resilience. And so I tried to write it as a pretty short, like 10-page paper that might get academics and people like dam removal practitioners and policymakers, a version that they would read. And then there's a fact sheet, and this fact sheet was put out by American Rivers and the Resources Legacy Fund Foundation. And along that, so these studies were funded by American Rivers, which is an organization about that one of their missions is to remove dams and barriers, and the Resources Legacy Fund. And so in doing this, these two groups originally came to me with this idea, and I said, well, my team at Utah State University needs really full control of the research itself, and then you guys can come in for messaging. And so we agreed on what everybody's roles would be so that we didn't get biased. And one thing I should have mentioned, I guess, in my method slide about the literature review, when organizations had a clear mission, I usually removed those studies. So I was looking for really the unbiased literature. And so with that, this is my last slide, and I'm happy to take any questions. I think we'll have quite a while for questions here.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I really appreciate how your research combines so many different aspects, the social and technical. Really, really interesting study. I want to ask first about the metrics. I think that's really interesting how you teased out a range of different metrics, and I'm wondering if, given limited resources, are there a few of them that you think are, 3 to 5 that are the top ones to focus on? Or does that vary by region? I mean, you had a pretty good global sample as well. What would you advise policymakers for targeting interventions based on the metrics you found?
I would say the most important is the human safety metrics. And so thinking about the return interval of floods, considering how that's changing, that seems to be fairly easy metrics to, easy measurements to be, and really important. Other than that, I would say they come down to really the objectives of dam and barrier removal. Are we removing barriers for fishes and fish populations, for tribes and cultures, or for sediment movement? And so, and then we can get into more specific metrics once we know the objectives. But I would say those human safety objectives are often the most important. Yeah.
Just a really quick follow-up on that, on the point about human safety. From your experience, what is the largest driver of risks to humans? Is it climate change, aging infrastructure? Does it vary geographically?
I think it varies geographically, but I would say the combination of aging infrastructure and climate change, and those two are on a collision course. Certainly in the US, where we haven't put enough funding into maintaining our infrastructure. But so it's easy to say, well, this dam's limping along, but then when we get, the storm of a century, or the 1,000-year storm, which is not uncommon in this day and age, it's happening with increased frequency, that, that's really when our infrastructure can become unsafe for the people living downstream. And we've had a few near misses too in the US, but also worldwide, where we have these more severe weather events paired with dams that haven't been getting the maintenance that they should have.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a fascinating study. My question is how this study can benefit because this is about removing the old and aged dam. But now when there are new dams are planned, how this study can support those planning as study the full life cycle of the dam from construction to removal. How you think this can benefit?
That's a great question. And in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, dams would usually be built for the 100-year flood event. And so I would say one thing that can be done is to broaden that, and so, and make that more stringent, maybe the 1,000-year flood event, something like that. In Yellowstone and in Texas, sorry, this is a little bit skewed to the US since that's where I live, but in Yellowstone and Texas, we recently have had these 1,000-year floods. And so they're rare, but they can happen. But I would say certainly expanding the design standard from the 100-year flood, especially using historical data, or, maybe if if engineers can do some predictions into the future, is this area expected to get wetter or drier? Those things could also help with updating design standards.
Okay, Professor, the topic is very interesting. My question is, when a dam has existed for 100 years, its surrounding environment has reached balance. Do you think so? My question is, if this dam is removed again, will it break the existing balance and take another 100 years to reach a new balance?
So can I repeat that? So was your question about a changing, say, 100-year flood frequency interval and how we manage for that? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
A new balance, I mean, is that?
So the environment has developed a certain equilibrium after building the dam.
Yeah.
Now, when you remove the dam, would it take a long time for the environment to adjust? It would be much about that adjustment process.
It's hard for me to hear. Sorry.
So
But I think the question was about if a dam has been in a location for a long time, say 100 years, and the ecosystem has reached a certain equilibrium because that dam has been there so long, when you then remove it after there's sort of been this equilibrium, what happens to the environment?
Oh, great. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I'm not sure that the dam removal science is always far enough to know that. I think in some places we are, like there have been a lot of studies about removing dams and say sediment transport. And we used to think that it would take decades to centuries to pass all that sediment downstream. And now we know that we're wrong about that it can take, usually less than 10 years to pass that sediment. But we don't know about the environmental effects of dam removal with all things. So we often don't know, with macroinvertebrate communities or diseases. And so like diseases that affect, say, fishes. And so there's a lot more research that does need to be done about how removing dams changes the environmental condition. Yeah, I wouldn't say we're totally there of understanding all the processes.
So apparently, just a follow-up question. Apparently, we still have a lot to investigate in this regard. The first thing, the moment we started, it's like we're even tracking a lot of money in here. We came up with this strong justification to construct dams, invested so much money into it. And then some years down the line, for whatever reason again, we're justifying, okay, let's remove this dam, again, committing huge amounts of money, into this. So I'm just wondering, this I think is this spiral or waiver effect, and in this complex world where we also need money in several things. So how do we justify this? Yes, I appreciate the fact that we are human, we are not the supreme being that understands everything, at the same time, but all the same, this is becoming a reality. Justify something based on science, implement it, then down the line, maybe priorities change either strategically or politically, and we are, taking the complete opposite, intervention, so apart from the impact on the environment and human economically as well, it's a huge responsibility. What's your thoughts on that?
Miriam, could you summarize that question? I could hear parts of it, but it's hard to hear in the back of the room. Sorry about that.
You want to conclude?
Or you can just, can you hear me better now, Sarah?
I kind of hear it's breaking up a bit. Thank you.
It's just me being be very not necessarily controversial, but it's worth thinking about. I was saying pretty much into your presentation. The first thing in my head is we committed a lot of resources in constructing that based on justification. I mean, we need to have good logic, for why we needed big infrastructure, the water infrastructure like that. And a lot of money was put into that. Then several years down the line, we're now coming up with another kind of strong justification, to remove this dam. Again, committing huge amount of money, So apart from the impact of this construction and removal on human life and the environment, it's also has huge economic, impact. A lot of money should also be invested in maybe some other places or some other challenging human development. So I'm just wondering, so what's the spiral, or wavering money spending into infrastructure that the scientists are, pushing for one reason or the other.
So I think I caught most of that. And so you were asking about the expenses, and it does cost a lot of money to remove dams. It costs a lot of money to build dams. It also costs a lot of money to maintain dams, and we don't. And that's something certainly throughout North America and Europe, where there's this backlog of needed maintenance. And every year, like in the United States, we just had this big infrastructure bill a number of years ago, maybe 3 years ago or so, and it's still nowhere near the amount of money needed. And so, yeah, we certainly do need money for all of these things. And it surprised me that often removing dams and barriers is the cheapest option. And that's not to say, when there are really important benefits from dams, of course, we would want to keep them. So if we have dams that are providing flood risk reduction and water supply and hydropower, they would hopefully they'd be shortlisted. But some of these other dams where the economics isn't working out in their favor anymore, it can be cheaper to remove them. And yeah, I've checked a number of studies, and they all say this. And then I asked the contacts that I work with at American Rivers, and I said, have you found this to be true? And they all said, yes, undoubtedly. So the economics is really interesting. And I think that there's a perception that removing dams is more expensive than maintaining them. And that may be the case in some situations, but it's often not. And I'm not sure if I addressed all your question because it was breaking up a bit.
I think I think about this one.
Do you have thoughts on why dam restoration? I found that figure really staggering, that it's 30 to 40% of the cost. What's your sense for why that is?
Sorry, can you repeat it? It's really hard to understand.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so much cheaper to remove dams than to restore them?
Some is due to new environmental regulations. And so the dams that were built, say, a century ago, were built with, they might not have to, they might not have had to consider water quality effects or effects on ecosystems. And so sometimes now we need dams to be retrofitted to consider or to be compliant with our environmental regulations. And so, well, we have environmental regulations and to protect our ecosystems, it has added costs to retrofit dams, to add fish ladders, which certainly aren't perfect. Fish ladders work under some circumstances, but they don't work in lots of conditions. And so it's expensive. And then, yeah, with the flood risk, where we're having changed hydrologies, where that takes considerable retrofits to update a dam to meet design specifications that it wasn't necessarily built for. That's where things get very expensive.
we eventually need to quantify or qualify cheaper. So cheaper economically or cheaper in terms of human life and the or cheaper in terms of environmentally.
Can you repeat that? Someone by that.
There's a need to quantify what cheaper means, whether cheaper in an economic sense or environmental sense.
Oh, yes, you're right. I was meaning economically, but you're right. We could think about, yeah, that's not the only way to quantify the value of something. Correct. Yeah.
Thank you for this evidence. To look at the review that went beyond the environmental impact and included social dimension. My question is about what do you think, how do you think this review can help in shared water resource with their dams and with a political rejection or challenge when it comes to a dam removal? And another thing, how do you think this can support the indigenous water rights in areas where indigenous people are there? Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. I think that this research, well, there's somewhat of a perception that societies remove dams purely for environmental reasons. And I think a major finding here was that that's increasingly not true. With climate variability, it might be more likely to remove dams for human safety. And so I think the idea of thinking about dam removal as an environmental topic is outdated. And mine's not the first study to say that. You know, some other studies that have been looking at increasing dam risk with maintenance or with climate variability have also kind of shown this. So I would say that's one thing. And then for newer dams being built, I think it's important to just think, you know, because every region is where it makes sense. Of course, dams are going to be built, and they should, you know, where water supply is needed, or hydropower or flood risk reduction. But to think about those design standards and to think about the end life of the dam, that this dam might be a good feature for 60 or 70 or 100 years, but there might come a time when it's no longer needed, or when it should be updated with new infrastructure. And so that's often not considered when anywhere builds dams, is really when to remove them and when they become unsafe. And so that's, I would say, something that we need globally is more thought there of the end life cycle of dams.
She has problems hearing us, so just thank her on my behalf. Yeah.
Thank you so much for another really fabulous presentation. I invite all of our viewers to watch your previous science talk as well. Thank you so much for sharing this. Good luck with the paper. Looking forward to reading that as well. And we look forward to having you back again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see you.